Neil Patterson here with the Sky News Daily, and look, a warning straight away. Today we're going to be talking about one of the great unmentionables, the end of our lives. Now, you might have heard of assisted dying, essentially the process by which people approaching the end of their lives might hasten their end through some form of pharmaceutical or medical assistance. Well, there is now an assisted dying bill going through Parliament, and it could even become law in the not too distant. So we are all about to have rather more of a national conversation about death than we've perhaps ever had. And the reason's obvious, of course. We don't like to think about, let alone discuss, dying, despite the only inevitability in life being the ending of it. So, on this podcast, I wanted to do something just a little different. And I know that for me, as well as many of you, it might just be a bit uncomfortable. We want to discuss the realities around dying, what it looks like for those approaching the end of their life and their relatives. You'll have heard talk of a good death. Does that actually exist? And what can we all do to make death less taboo? Dr. Rachel Clark is an author, a broadcaster, and herself works in palliative care, of course, the care for the terminally ill and their families. Rachel, it's great to have you on the Sky News Daily. Before we get into the long grass on this, what was it that led you to a career in palliative care?
A few weeks before I was due to get married, and then I was halfway through my medical degree, my fiancé Dave's mum was diagnosed very suddenly with terminal cancer, and I literally sort of finished my final year exams and rushed to the hospital to be with them. He and his dad had sat with her all through the day, and I offered to do the night shift essentially while they got some rest. And she was incredibly distressed. She was in huge amounts of pain. She was frightened. She was suffering. And it was a very shocking example of how dying in Britain in the NHS can go very badly. Not because that suffering was necessary and essential, but because she wasn't getting morphine, she wasn't getting the right medicines. And in the morning, I said to her consultant, you have to get the palliative care team involved. You have to get them to see her now. And they came in, and within half an hour, they had helped her. They had given her the drugs she needed. She was beautifully calm, peaceful, able to hold her son's hand, do all of those important things. And I saw in that moment the power of palliative care, because if you get it right, and sometimes getting it right is as simple as paying attention to what a patient needs, you can transform them from unbearable suffering to a death that is gentle and peaceful and full of dignity and even grace. And that blew my mind as a medical student.
I mean, Rachel, why do you think we in this country seemingly struggle so much to talk about it openly?
So 100 years ago, Victorian England, most people died at home. And so we all had this familiarity with death and the dying process because we saw it. It wasn't tucked away behind hospital doors. It was something we witnessed at home. But now the majority of people don't die in a home, they die in hospital or care homes. And so often we just don't see it. We've lost that familiarity with the process. And also, of course, dying is understandably a frightening topic because it's the most kind of existential form of angst, really, that human beings experience. We are the one living creature who knows that we are destined to die. And that means losing contact with everything we love in the world. And that's a very hard thing, I think, psychologically for us to confront.
I mean, isn't the best evidence that we don't talk about death enough is that, practically none of us understand what happens. I'm the son of two biologists, and I don't know the practical steps that the body goes through when it is reaching the end, and perhaps you can tell me.
What's interesting is there are patterns to dying in exactly the same way that there are patterns, say, to giving birth. And we can often predict how things are going to develop. Usually, to begin with, there's a gradual deterioration in a patient. So they'll become sleepy, They'll often need naps in the afternoon, then the naps will turn into naps through the day. And then gradually they might reach a point where sometimes they're so deeply asleep you're not even sure you can wake them up, and they might flit in and out of this very sleepy, almost unconscious state. And gradually, as the organs in the body start to shut down, so your heart or your liver or your kidneys or your brain, they all have the same effect, which is to reduce consciousness. So if your liver is failing, for example, you get lots of toxins building up in the bloodstream that make you sleepy, and eventually you just slip into a coma. The same happens if your kidneys fail, sometimes if your heart fails. So you eventually reach a state where you're deeply unconscious, and then often the parts of the brain that control your breathing change as well. So your breathing pattern changes, and there may be long pauses, stopping and starting in your breathing. And that can be very worrying for family members, because they're worried that the patient, that their loved one may be taking their last breath, and there'll be a pause, and then suddenly the patient will breathe again. And sometimes there's what's known as the rattle. Some people may have heard the horrible phrase death rattle. And that's a noisy breathing that's caused by the fact that usually we always make a little bit of saliva that we're swallowing without realizing. And if you're very, very weak and deeply unconscious, you don't swallow it. So there's noise of air as you breathe going past a little bit of saliva. And once you explain that to their families, is much less frightening. And then at some stage, one of those pauses turns into a breath out, a pause, and no longer another breath in. And sometimes families don't actually realise that their loved one has died. And it really is that gentle, provided the care is right.
I mean, people often talk about the concept of there being a good death for the individual and for the family and friends that are closest to them. I mean, is that a concept that you recognise? Is that a thing that can be achieved, or is indeed even a goal of yours in your career in palliative care?
Oh, yes, completely, Neil. I mean, I can't stress how important it is. And I don't mean a good death in a prescriptive sense. It means literally a death that's as close as possible to how the patient would like to die. Most people want their death to be peaceful, pain-free, and ideally with the people they love at their bedside. But not everybody's the same. It's honestly the case that if you can get it right, even patients who are incredibly frightened, and I have met patients who have been so frightened of dying, they've even asked me to help them end their life because they're so frightened of suffering. Even with patients like that, sometimes if you can get the palliative care right, you can transform the experience. And we will do everything we can to make that happen. Even in a hospital, if they want to be outside, they want fresh air and sunshine or bird song, we will say, right, that's fine. You can't get into a wheelchair, but we can wheel your bed outside. Let's get you to experience these precious things. If they want to enjoy a little sip of beer one evening because that's what they used to have at home, then I'll make sure that we get their favourite brand of beer in to give them because that's what they need. You know, any of these little things, getting their pets in. I love we've had dogs, cats. Once in the hospice, we even got a prize-winning bull into the hospice gardens. Genuinely, we had a patient who was a farmer, and we asked his wife what would mean the most to him, and she said, well, you'll have to get his bull in. He loves that bull far more than me.
Well, Rachel, given the job that you do and the fact that you are, as you've already said, that you see death every day, I mean, to what extent have you thought about your own mortality?
I'm not going to lie, I am frightened of symptoms at the end of life because I know how desperately threadbare the NHS is across the board. And particularly palliative care, the bulk of palliative care, it isn't even NHS funded, it's only funded by charities. So I may slip through the net like so many other patients, and I am frightened of that. I have an advanced care plan, and I would really recommend everybody listening to do the same. You don't need anything legal, just tell your family what matters to you. If I have a catastrophic brain injury, I don't want to be kept alive. I just want to end my life. And I really would like to see an otter in the wild before I die. I've spent most of my adult life trying to see an otter, so that's important. Those are my 2 bits of my advanced care plan. We can all have that conversation over a cup of tea.
I can certainly recommend a few places you can spot otters, back in the motherland, perhaps not down here.
I bet you can.
Perhaps not down here. Rachel, just pause there for a second. We're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we will be continuing to discuss the realities of dying in the UK. Welcome back to the Daily. Dr. Rachel Clark, practising palliative care doctor, still with us. Look, Rachel, you've touched on this already, about the state of palliative care in the United Kingdom. I mean, Sky News has been looking at it today, and it certainly doesn't look good. I mean, do you look forward to going into work?
So I'm one of those really irritating people who can genuinely say, I look forward to going to work every single day. I absolutely love it. I work in a really big, busy hospital in quite a deprived area, so conditions are really tough. We have, we're sometimes on black alert, the hospital's full, all of those sort of horror stories you hear about. But I work with an amazing small team of doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals in palliative care. And I know that even though conditions can be really tough, with every single patient I see, I've got the potential to help them and make a difference.
But sometimes you will be having end-of-life conversations, not in a private room, but on a gurney, in a corridor somewhere. I mean, as you've mentioned, the hospice sector is predominantly charitably funded, which I don't think many people know about. How do you feel working in this area, looking at the provisions that we make? Why does the UK get this so badly wrong, do you think?
It's so hard to understand. The cliche, the slogan about the NHS is that it will protect you and care for you cradle to grave. So obviously maternity services are NHS funded. They're clearly core services, and yet the grave end of the spectrum is not. It's not treated like a core NHS service. And I cannot believe that the majority of the hospice and palliative care we provide to children as well as adults is not funded through the government, through the NHS. It's funded by charity. Literally, there is a hospital, for example, in Liverpool facing closure at the moment, a hospice that cares for babies because they don't have enough money to stay open, and they are having to resort to desperate, frantic, charitable pleas to people out of their goodness of their hearts to keep them alive. So I just cannot understand why this isn't the absolute top of Wes Streeting's agenda. He has spoken so vocally about the NHS being broken, so he has to know that hospice and palliative care is wildly underfunded. Why is he not speaking out on behalf of dying people? He's a man who's been through cancer himself. Why is he not shouting from the rooftops and saying, I will be the health secretary who ends the absolute nationwide lottery of whether a patient suffers at the end of their life because we have not fixed the funding of palliative and hospice care?
Instead, the conversation in politics, at least at the moment, when it comes to this area, is not around palliative care. It is around the private members' bill on assisted dying that has started its way moving through Parliament. Where do you stand on that issue?
Of course, the thinking behind the private members' bill that's in Parliament today is precisely compassion. This is about avoiding suffering, trying to minimise suffering at the end of life. And I have immense sympathy with that. And I'm very conscious of the fact that the conditions I've just described to you of failure of adequate care for so many dying patients in the UK is itself, you could say, an argument for assisted dying. If patients are suffering on gurneys at the end of life in A&E, how on earth have we got to that state? And wouldn't this bill take away suffering and also fear of suffering? The enormous concern I have about a change in the law now, though, is this fundamental fact that right now, Britain in 2024 is not willing to provide the resources to take away all that avoidable suffering that we could prevent at the end of life. My concern is if the law changes and assisted dying is legalised before we address the unforgivable failures to fund and resource proper care for dying people, it is those conditions of suffering that will drive people into ending their lives prematurely. So they're not having assistance in dying because their life is not worth living. It's because we haven't cared for them in such a way that their life still has meaning and value. My other great concern about assisted dying is, and we've seen this in other countries around the world, it is in economic terms much, much cheaper to assist someone in ending their life than it is to provide them with the basic care that makes their life worth living.
And I suppose that the assisted dying bill, one absolute inevitability of it going through Parliament is that we are all going to be talking about that much more, which can only be a positive thing. And I suppose in that spirit, I cannot imagine how many people you have treated over the years that you have been working in this sector. But there must be some who, when their memory comes to the front of your mind, that you smile. I just wonder if there's any that you could tell me about.
Oh, completely. So I can name this patient because she gave me permission to tell her story, to teach. I teach lots of medical students. And she was a woman called Diane Finch, a wonderful woman who had metastatic breast cancer and a young son. And the breast cancer spread to her brain, and she was incredibly frightened about sort of losing herself. And she was really tortured by that. And she was sitting in her garden one day thinking about this. And then she listened to the song of a blackbird in a tree in her garden. And blackbirds have this absolutely sort of joyful kind of torrent of notes in their song. And she heard this blackbird just singing its heart out. And she realised that although she would soon be gone, these were the cycles of nature. There would still be the beauty of blackbirds and everything else that's beautiful in the world. And this inspired her to write a song with the music therapist in the hospice where I worked. And the song that she wrote was the most beautiful expression of all of that, which was later played at her funeral. But I remember Diane in her hospice room with her whole family around her, including her son, absolutely being love-bombed to within an inch of her life. You know, there was so much love in the room, you felt like it was almost physical, you could hardly get through it. And instead of being frightened at the end, she found a kind of peace with being part of the natural cycles of life. And I found that really profound and moving, because I think as a mum myself, one of the things I find so difficult to imagine is the heartbreak of leaving your children and leaving them to fend for yourself. But actually, this is life, and they are still surrounded by the love of other people. And Diane, my incredible patient Diane, taught me all of that, so I will never ever forget her.
Bloody hell, Rachel, you've got me going at the other end now as well. No, that's a wonderful story, and indeed it's been a fantastic conversation. Dr. Rachel Clark, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. If you need to talk to someone about any of the issues we've been discussing, I can recommend speaking to end of life charity Marie Curie. Their phone number 0800 090 2309. You can also chat via their website, mariecurie.org.uk. We'll see you again tomorrow.